The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestone plaza outside Buckingham Palace as tourists gathered for the daily changing of the guard ceremony. Among the crowd stood Sarah Martinez, a travel blogger from Spain clutching her worn leather messenger bag tightly against her chest. She had saved for 3 years to make this trip to London, and today was the culmination of her dream vacation. Sarah's bag contained more than just typical tourist items. Hidden beneath her camera and guidebooks lay something precious beyond measure, a small wooden music box that had belonged to her late grandmother, Maria. The elderly woman had passed away just 6 months earlier, leaving Sarah heartbroken but determined to fulfill a promise she had made at her grandmother's bedside. Maria had spent her youth working as a seamstress in a small Spanish village, but she had always dreamed of seeing the British royal family. She would spend hours telling young Sarah stories about princesses and queens, about grand palaces and royal ceremonies. As Maria's health declined, she made Sarah promise to take the music box to Buckingham Palace and somehow, in whatever way possible, let it witness the pageantry that Maria never could. The music box itself was simple, carved from olive wood by Maria's own father decades ago. When wound, it played a gentle melody while a tiny ballerina spun slowly inside. To anyone else, it might seem worthless, but to Sarah, it represented a lifetime of love and unfulfilled dreams. As Sarah positioned herself among the growing crowd, she noticed the rigid formation of the Queen's Guard standing at attention. Their red tunics and tall black bearskin hats created an impressive display of British tradition. She had read about these soldiers, how they were trained to remain motionless regardless of weather, distractions, or tourist behavior. The ceremony was scheduled to begin in an hour, but already the area buzzed with excitement. Families with children pressed closer to the palace gates, hoping for the best view. Street performers entertained the waiting crowds, and vendors sold Union Jack souvenirs and postcards. Among the spectators was 7-year-old Emma Thompson, visiting London with her parents from Manchester. Emma had been fascinated by royal stories since she learned to read, and this was her first visit to see the guards in person. Her blonde curls bounced as she skipped excitedly between her mother and father, asking endless questions about the palace and the soldiers. Emma's mother, Rebecca, kept a careful eye on her energetic daughter while her husband, David, attempted to capture family photos with the palace in the background. Like many parents in crowded tourist areas, Rebecca felt the constant worry of keeping track of her child in the bustling environment. The morning air carried a mix of languages as visitors from around the world gathered to witness the ceremony. Sarah found herself standing near a group of Japanese tourists who were discussing the history of the guard uniforms in broken English. She smiled, remembering how her grandmother would have loved to hear all these different voices coming together in appreciation of British culture. As more people arrived, the crowd grew denser. Sarah instinctively pulled her bag closer, feeling the slight weight of the music box inside. She had planned this moment carefully, hoping to find a way to honor her grandmother's memory during the ceremony. Perhaps she could wind the music box during the guard change, letting its melody play softly as a private tribute to Maria. The security presence around the palace was substantial but discreet. Plainclothes officers mingled with the crowd while uniformed police maintained visible positions at key points. Sarah noticed their watchful eyes scanning the gathering tourists, and she felt grateful for their protection. Young Emma had grown increasingly excited as the ceremony time approached. She tugged on her mother's hand, pointing at different guards and asking if they were real soldiers. Her father explained that these were indeed real military personnel, trained professionals who served as both ceremonial guards and active security for the royal family. The morning sun climbed higher, warming the plaza and creating a perfect atmosphere for the anticipated ceremony. Sarah checked her watch, noting they still had 45 minutes before the official start time. She decided to use this time to position herself for the best possible view while keeping her grandmother's music box safe. As she moved through the crowd, Sarah noticed how diverse the gathering was. Families with young children, elderly couples fulfilling bucket list dreams, solo travelers like herself, and local Londoners who never tired of this display of British tradition. Everyone seemed united in their anticipation of witnessing something special. The imposing facade of Buckingham Palace served as a backdrop to the growing excitement. Its limestone walls and ornate architecture spoke of centuries of British history, and Sarah felt a deep connection to all the people who had stood in this same spot over the decades. Sharing similar moments of wonder and anticipation, Emma's parents noticed their daughter's growing restlessness and decided to move closer to the front of the crowd. As they navigated through the sea of people, Emma's attention was caught by Sarah's distinctive leather bag. The young girl had always been drawn to unique objects, and something about the bag's worn appearance and the way Sarah held it so carefully sparked her curiosity. The atmosphere continued to build as street performers packed up their acts and vendors made final sales pitches to the assembled crowd. The sense of anticipation was palpable, with conversations growing quieter as people prepared to witness the traditional ceremony that had been performed in various forms for centuries. Sarah took a deep breath, feeling her grandmother's presence with her in this moment. She gently touched the bag containing the music box, whispering a silent promise that Maria's dream of experiencing royal pageantry would finally be fulfilled, even if in a way neither of them had originally imagined. The stage was set for what should have been a routine tourist experience, but fate had other plans brewing in the crowd that morning. As the ceremony time approached, the crowd's energy reached a fever pitch. Emma Thompson's excitement had been building throughout the morning, and she found herself unable to stand still. Her parents, David and Rebecca, were doing their best to keep her contained while also trying to enjoy the experience themselves. Emma's gaze kept returning to Sarah Martinez and her intriguing leather bag. The young girl had developed an almost magnetic fascination with the worn messenger bag that Sarah clutched so protectively. There was something about the way the Spanish woman held it, as if it contained the most precious treasure in the world, that captured Emma's imagination completely. "Mummy, what do you think is in that lady's bag?" Emma whispered to her mother, pointing discreetly toward Sarah. Rebecca glanced over and saw Sarah standing quietly, her hands wrapped around her bag's strap. "I don't know, sweetheart. Probably just her camera and tourist things like everyone else." But Emma wasn't convinced. Her 7-year-old mind was already spinning stories about the mysterious bag. Maybe it contained royal jewels or secret messages or magical objects like in the fairy tales she loved so much. The more she watched Sarah, the more certain Emma became that something extraordinary was hidden inside that leather bag. David was busy adjusting his camera settings, trying to capture the perfect shot of the palace guards. He had promised his colleagues back in Manchester that he would bring back professional quality photos of their London trip. The lighting was perfect, and he was determined not to miss any important moments of the ceremony. Meanwhile, Sarah remained focused on her own mission. She carefully removed the small wooden music box from her bag, keeping it concealed in her hands. The olive wood felt warm and smooth beneath her fingers, and she could feel the slight resistance of the winding mechanism. This was the moment she had traveled so far to create, a moment where her grandmother's dream could finally be realized. The Queen's Guard maintained their rigid positions despite the growing crowd around them. Guardsman James Mitchell, a 24-year-old soldier from Wales, stood at attention near the palace gates. He had been serving with the Guard for 18 months and had witnessed countless ceremonies, but he never lost his appreciation for the tradition and honor of his position. James had trained extensively for his role, learning not only the precise movements and timing of the ceremonial duties, but also the security protocols that were essential to protecting the royal family and the public. His training had taught him to be constantly aware of his surroundings while maintaining the stoic appearance that tourists expected from the Queen's Guard. As Sarah prepared to wind her grandmother's music box, she noticed the perfect timing approaching. The ceremony was about to begin, and she wanted the gentle melody to play during the most meaningful moment. She positioned herself where she could see the guards clearly, while keeping the music box hidden from view. Emma's curiosity had reached a breaking point. She tugged insistently on her mother's sleeve, trying to get closer to Sarah and the mysterious bag. "Mommy, I want to see what's in that bag. Can we ask her?" "Emma, you can't just ask strangers about their personal belongings," Rebecca replied firmly. That wouldn't be polite. But Emma's young mind had already moved beyond polite convention. Her imagination had convinced her that Sarah's bag contained something magical, something that needed to be investigated. When her parents became distracted by the beginning movements of the ceremony, Emma saw her opportunity. The 7-year-old began to slowly work her way through the crowd toward Sarah. Her small size made it easy to slip between adults who were focused on the spectacle unfolding before them. Emma's heart raced with excitement as she got closer to the mysterious woman with the fascinating bag. Sarah was completely absorbed in her private moment of tribute to her grandmother. She had successfully wound the music box, and the tiny ballerina was beginning to spin as the gentle melody played softly. Tears formed in her eyes as she thought about Maria, wishing her beloved grandmother could somehow witness this moment of royal pageantry. The ceremony officially began with the approach of the new guard. The precision of their movements, the crisp sound of their footsteps on the cobblestones, and the traditional military commands created an atmosphere of solemn dignity. The crowd fell into respectful silence, many people recording the moment on their phones and cameras. James Mitchell and his fellow guardsmen began their carefully choreographed movements. Every step was precise, every turn executed with military perfection. The ceremony represented not just tradition, but active military service, and James felt the weight of that responsibility with every movement. Emma had now positioned herself directly behind Sarah, close enough to reach out and touch the leather bag. The little girl's breathing quickened with anticipation. She could hear a faint, sweet melody coming from somewhere near Sarah, which only strengthened her conviction that something magical was happening. As the guard ceremony reached its most dramatic moment, with the formal exchange of duties taking place, Emma made her move. She reached out quickly and grabbed at Sarah's bag, trying to peek inside to solve the mystery that had consumed her young mind. Sarah, startled by the sudden contact, instinctively pulled her bag away from the unexpected touch. The music box, which she had been holding carefully concealed, slipped from her grasp. Time seemed to slow as the precious wooden object tumbled through the air. The music box hit the cobblestones with a sharp crack, and its delicate internal mechanism scattered across the plaza. The tiny ballerina broke free from her housing, rolling several feet away from the destroyed music box. The gentle melody stopped abruptly, replaced by the sound of tourists gasping and Emma beginning to cry. Guardsman Mitchell, trained to notice any unusual disturbance, saw the commotion developing in the crowd. His peripheral vision caught the movement of people reacting to something, and his security instincts immediately activated. While maintaining his ceremonial position, he began assessing the situation to determine if intervention might be necessary. Sarah stared in horror at the broken remains of her grandmother's treasured music box scattered across the ground. 6 months of planning, 3 years of saving, and a lifetime of love had culminated in this devastating moment. The tiny wooden pieces seemed to mock her good intentions. As tourists began to notice the disturbance, Emma's parents finally realized their daughter had wandered away and were frantically searching the crowd for her. When they spotted her crying near Sarah and the broken music box, they rushed through the mass of people to reach her. The ceremony continued around them, but a small drama was unfolding that would soon escalate beyond anyone's imagination. The sound of Emma's crying grew louder as she realized what she had done. The 7-year-old stood frozen among the scattered pieces of the destroyed music box, her small hands covering her mouth in shock. The magnitude of her actions was beginning to dawn on her young mind, and the guilt was overwhelming. Sarah knelt down slowly, her hands trembling as she tried to gather the broken pieces of her grandmother's treasured music box. Each fragment felt like a piece of her heart breaking all over again. The olive wood that had been so carefully carved by her great-grandfather decades ago was now split and damaged beyond repair. The tiny ballerina lay motionless several feet away, her delicate porcelain face cracked down the middle. I'm so sorry, Emma sobbed, tears streaming down her cheeks. I just wanted to see what was inside. I thought it was something magical. David and Rebecca Thompson finally pushed through the crowd and reached their daughter. Rebecca immediately saw the broken music box and understood that Emma had somehow caused this destruction. Her maternal instincts kicked in as she pulled Emma close while simultaneously feeling mortified by her daughter's behavior. Oh my goodness. We are so incredibly sorry, Rebecca said to Sarah, her voice filled with genuine distress. Emma, what have you done? This is exactly why we tell you not to touch other people's things. David knelt down next to Sarah, trying to help gather the scattered pieces. Please let us replace this for you. Whatever it costs, we'll take care of it. I can't believe Emma would do something like this. Sarah looked up at the concerned parents, her eyes still filled with tears. "You don't understand," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the crowd noise. "This can't be replaced. It belonged to my grandmother who passed away 6 months ago. She made me promise to bring it here, to let her experience the royal ceremony she always dreamed of seeing." The weight of Sarah's words hit the Thompson family like a physical blow. Rebecca felt her own eyes fill with tears as she realized the true significance of what had been destroyed. This wasn't just a tourist trinket or a valuable antique. It was an irreplaceable family heirloom connected to a dying woman's final wish. Emma's sobs intensified as she began to understand that her curiosity had destroyed something far more precious than she had imagined. "I thought it was treasure," she hiccuped between tears. "I heard pretty music and I thought it was magic." Guardsman James Mitchell had been watching the developing situation with growing concern. While his training required him to maintain his ceremonial position during the guard change, his security awareness was fully engaged. He could see that a disturbance was growing in the crowd, and several tourists were beginning to gather around the emotional scene. The ceremony continued around them with military precision, but James knew that any significant disruption could potentially affect the proceedings. He had witnessed similar situations before where tourist incidents had escalated unexpectedly, and his experience told him to remain alert for any signs that this might develop into a security concern. Sarah carefully placed the largest piece of the broken music box into her bag, along with several smaller fragments. The delicate internal mechanism that had once played her grandmother's favorite melody was completely destroyed, its tiny gears and springs scattered beyond recovery. She picked up the broken ballerina figure, noting how the crack across its face seemed to mirror her own heartbreak. "My grandmother spent her whole life dreaming of seeing British royalty," Sarah explained to the Thompsons, her voice gaining strength despite her emotional state. "She grew up poor in a small Spanish village working as a seamstress, but she would tell me stories about queens and princesses for hours. When she was dying, she made me promise to bring this music box to London, to somehow let it witness what she never could." Rebecca felt a deep ache in her chest as she listened to Sarah's story. As a mother herself, she could imagine the pain of losing a beloved parent and the importance of honoring their final wishes. The fact that her daughter had unknowingly destroyed such a meaningful tribute made the situation even more heartbreaking. "There has to be something we can do," David said desperately. "Maybe we could find someone who repairs antique music boxes. Or perhaps we could commission a replica. Please, just tell us how we can make this right." Emma had stopped crying but remained close to her mother, still overwhelmed by the gravity of what she had done. Her young mind was struggling to process how her innocent curiosity had caused such pain to a complete stranger. The magical treasure she had imagined had turned out to be something far more precious than any fairy tale object. Other tourists began to notice the emotional scene unfolding near them. Some stopped to ask if everyone was all right, while others simply stared with curiosity before returning their attention to the ongoing ceremony. The contrast between the formal military precision of the guard change and the very human drama playing out in the crowd created a surreal atmosphere. Sarah stood up slowly, clutching her bag with the broken pieces inside. "I appreciate your offer," she said to the Thompsons, "but this isn't about money or replacement. This was the actual music box that my grandmother wound every night before bed. It was made by her father's hands. The wood came from an olive tree that grew in their family's courtyard for over a century. The historical significance of the destroyed object was becoming clear to everyone involved. This wasn't just a sentimental keepsake. It was a tangible connection to generations of family history, now lost forever because of one child's moment of curiosity." James Mitchell noticed that the group near the disturbance was growing larger and more emotional. His training had taught him to identify potential security risks, and while this appeared to be an accident rather than a deliberate incident, he knew that emotional situations could sometimes escalate unpredictably in crowded public spaces. The guardsman made a subtle hand signal to his fellow soldiers, indicating that he was aware of the situation and monitoring its development. The ceremony continued without interruption, but James remained ready to take action if the disturbance threatened public safety or security. Emma tugged on her mother's coat sleeve, her voice small and scared. "Mommy, what can I do to fix this?" "I want to help the nice lady with her grandmother's music box." The innocent question from the 7-year-old only intensified the emotional weight of the situation. as everyone realized that some broken things simply cannot be repaired, no matter how desperately we want to make them whole again. As the emotional weight of the situation continued to build, Sarah made a decision that surprised everyone, including herself. Instead of walking away in anger or despair, she knelt down to Emma's eye level and spoke gently to the tearful child. "Emma, is that your name?" Sarah asked softly, having heard the parents use it. When the little girl nodded, Sarah continued, "You know what? My grandmother would have loved to meet you. She always said that children have the purest hearts, and she would have understood that you were just curious." Emma's eyes widened with surprise. She had expected anger, maybe even shouting. But instead, this kind woman was speaking to her with warmth despite the terrible thing that had happened. She would have liked me? Even though I broke her special music box? Yes, she would have, Sarah replied, managing a small smile despite her grief. My grandmother Maria believed that mistakes happen when we're trying to discover something beautiful. She used to tell me that curiosity is a gift, even when it sometimes leads us into trouble. Rebecca watched this exchange with amazement. Here was a woman who had just lost an irreplaceable family heirloom, yet she was comforting the child who had destroyed it. The grace and compassion Sarah was showing in her moment of loss was extraordinary. David felt a deep respect developing for this stranger, who was handling such a devastating situation with remarkable dignity. "You are an incredible person," he said to Sarah. "Most people would be furious, and they would have every right to be." "Being angry won't bring back the music box," Sarah replied practically. "And my grandmother taught me that holding on to anger only hurts the person carrying it. She would want me to find a way to turn this sadness into something positive." Guardsman James Mitchell continued to monitor the situation while maintaining his ceremonial duties. He had witnessed many tourist incidents during his service, but rarely had he seen such an emotionally charged situation handled with such grace. His respect for the Spanish woman was growing, even as his security awareness remained heightened. The ceremony was reaching its climax, with the formal exchange of guard duties taking place in precise military fashion. The sounds of commands being called out and boots marching in unison provided a dramatic backdrop to the personal drama unfolding in the crowd. Emma had stopped crying completely now, fascinated by Sarah's kindness. "What was your grandmother like?" she asked with the direct curiosity that only children possess. Sarah's face lit up as she began to share memories of Maria. She was tiny, just like you, but she had the biggest heart in the world. She would sing while she worked, and she made the most beautiful clothes for all the women in our village. Every evening, she would wind that music box and tell me stories about faraway places and royal families. "Did she tell you stories about the Queen's Guard?" Emma asked, gesturing toward the ceremonial soldiers. "Oh yes," Sarah laughed softly. She knew all about British traditions. She would describe the red uniforms and the tall black hats in such detail that I felt like I had seen them myself before I ever came to London. As Sarah shared these memories, something unexpected began to happen. Other tourists who had been watching the emotional scene started to gather closer, drawn by the touching story and Sarah's remarkable response to the situation. Word began to spread through the crowd about the broken music box and the Spanish woman's grandmother. An elderly British woman named Margaret Fletcher, who had been attending the guard ceremonies for over 30 years, approached the group. "Excuse me, dear," she said to Sarah, "but I couldn't help overhearing your story. I think what you're doing for your grandmother is beautiful, and I'm so sorry about your loss." Margaret's intervention seemed to open floodgates of sympathy from the surrounding tourists. A Japanese couple offered to help pay for any repairs, while a family from Germany expressed their condolences for Sarah's grandmother. The broken music box had somehow created an unexpected community of strangers united in empathy. Emma watched, with wide eyes as more and more people approached to offer support and comfort to Sarah. The little girl was beginning to understand that her mistake had revealed something important about human kindness and the way people could come together in moments of sadness. "Look, Emma," her mother whispered. "See how this lady's kindness is bringing out the best in everyone around us? This is what happens when we choose love over anger." James Mitchell was now dealing with a situation he had never encountered in his military training. The crowd around the emotional scene was growing larger, but rather than becoming more agitated or potentially dangerous, the gathering was becoming increasingly positive and supportive. His security instincts told him to remain alert, but his human side was moved by what he was witnessing. A street performer who had been entertaining tourists earlier in the morning approached the group carrying his guitar case. "I heard about what happened," he said to Sarah. "I can't fix your music box, but maybe I could play something in honor of your grandmother." Sarah was overwhelmed by the unexpected outpouring of support from complete strangers. "That's very kind," she managed to say, "but you don't need to do that." "Yes, we do," the performer replied simply. "Your grandmother's dream was to experience British royal tradition, right? Well, maybe we can't give her that music box back, but we can make sure her memory is honored here, in the way she would have wanted." Emma tugged on Sarah's sleeve. "Can I help honor your grandmother too? I want to do something good instead of just being the girl who broke something important." The question from the 7-year-old touched Sarah's heart deeply. She could almost hear her grandmother Maria's voice encouraging her to let the child participate in whatever tribute might unfold. Maria had always believed that children should be included in important family moments, even sad ones. "Yes, Emma, I think my grandmother would love for you to be part of this," Sarah said, taking the little girl's hand gently. As the formal guard ceremony concluded with military precision, an informal ceremony of human compassion was beginning to take shape in the crowd of tourists. What had started as a moment of accidental destruction was transforming into something beautiful and unexpected, though none of them yet realized how much more dramatic this day would become. The impromptu gathering around Sarah and Emma had grown to include nearly 30 tourists from various countries. The street performer, who introduced himself as Tommy, began to tune his guitar while Margaret Fletcher, the elderly British woman, helped organize the spontaneous tribute. Word of the touching story was spreading through the crowd faster than anyone had anticipated. "What was your grandmother's favorite song?" Tommy asked Sarah as he prepared to play. Sarah thought for a moment, remembering the countless evenings she had spent listening to Maria's gentle humming while she worked on her sewing. She loved a Spanish lullaby called Estrelita, but she also had a fondness for Amazing Grace. She said it reminded her that beautiful things could come from difficult times. "I know both of those," Tommy smiled, his fingers finding the familiar chords. "Let's start with Amazing Grace since we're here at a British ceremony." As the guitarist began to play the beloved hymn, something remarkable happened. Margaret Fletcher began to sing along in her clear, elderly voice, and soon other members of the international crowd joined in, each singing in their own language or simply humming the melody they recognized. Emma stood close to Sarah, holding her hand tightly and trying to hum along with the adults. The 7-year-old felt a mixture of sadness for the broken music box and amazement at how her mistake had brought all these strangers together. She was beginning to understand that sometimes the most beautiful moments could grow from the most painful ones. Guardsman James Mitchell found himself in an unprecedented situation. The formal ceremony had concluded successfully, but now he was witnessing something that had never happened during his 18 months of service. A crowd of tourists was holding an impromptu memorial service just meters from his post, and the emotional impact was undeniable. James had been trained to handle many types of security situations, but nothing in his military education had prepared him for deciding whether this gathering might constitute a security risk. The crowd was peaceful, even reverent, but it was also growing larger and becoming more organized by the minute. As Amazing Grace concluded, Sarah wiped tears from her eyes and addressed the gathered crowd. "Thank you all so much. My grandmother Maria would be amazed to know that her simple dream of seeing British royalty had touched the hearts of people from so many different countries. Tell us more about her," called out a woman with a German accent. "What was she like as a young woman?" Sarah looked around at the expectant faces and realized that these strangers genuinely wanted to honor her grandmother's memory. Maria was born in 1943 in a small village in Andalusia. Her family had very little money, but she was incredibly talented with a needle and thread. By the time she was 16, she was making wedding dresses for brides from villages dozens of kilometers away. Emma listened intently as Sarah shared her grandmother's story. The little girl was learning about a world very different from her comfortable life in Manchester, and she was beginning to understand why the music box had been so precious. During the 1960s, Sarah continued, Maria became fascinated with British culture, especially the royal family. She would save her pesetas to buy British magazines, and she taught herself to read English by studying articles about Queen Elizabeth and Princess Margaret. She dreamed of someday visiting London, but life always got in the way. A Japanese tourist named Hiroshi stepped forward. "In my country, we believe that when someone dies with an unfulfilled dream, their loved ones can complete that dream for them. You brought your grandmother's spirit here today, even though the music box was broken." Sarah nodded gratefully. "That's exactly what I was trying to do. She made me promise during her final weeks that I would somehow bring her to see the place she had dreamed about her entire life." James Mitchell was now facing a dilemma that required immediate decision-making. The crowd around the memorial gathering had grown to over 50 people, and more tourists were stopping to find out what was happening. While the gathering remained peaceful and respectful, the size was beginning to concern him from a security standpoint. The guardsman knew he had two options. He could call for backup to disperse the crowd, which would end this touching tribute, but ensure security protocol was maintained, or he could continue monitoring the situation and hope it remained peaceful. His human instincts told him this was a beautiful moment that deserved protection, but his military training demanded that he prioritize security above sentiment. Emma had been listening to Sarah's stories with growing fascination, and now she had an idea that excited her young imagination. "Could we write a letter to the Queen about your grandmother? Maybe she would want to know about Maria's dream." The suggestion came from such innocent hope that several adults in the crowd smiled, despite the emotional weight of the situation. But Margaret Fletcher, who had been attending royal ceremonies for decades, surprised everyone by taking the idea seriously. "You know," Margaret said thoughtfully, "that's not as impossible as it might sound. The Queen does read letters from the public, especially ones that touch on themes of dedication and service, and this story certainly qualifies." David Thompson, who had been quietly observing the remarkable transformation of his daughter's mistake into something meaningful, stepped forward. "If we're going to write to the Queen, we should do it properly. I work in communications back in Manchester. I could help draft something appropriate." Sarah was overwhelmed by the generosity of these strangers who had turned a moment of loss into an opportunity for connection and healing. "I never imagined anything like this would happen. Maria always said that the British people were known for their kindness, but experiencing it personally is incredible." Tommy the street performer struck up another song, this time choosing Estrelita, the Spanish lullaby that had been Maria's favorite. He had looked up the chords on his phone and was doing his best to capture the gentle melody that had once emerged from the now broken music box. As the familiar tune filled the air, Sarah closed her eyes and could almost hear her grandmother's voice humming along. For a moment it felt as though Maria was truly there, experiencing the royal pageantry she had dreamed about for so many decades. James Mitchell made his decision. The gathering was peaceful, respectful, and genuinely moving. However, he also knew that crowds this size near the palace required proper monitoring. He discreetly activated his radio to request additional security presence, not to disperse the crowd, but to ensure that this beautiful moment could continue safely. What none of them realized was that James's radio communication was being monitored by the Palace Security Command Center, and the mention of a large gathering of tourists would trigger protocols that would soon escalate this touching tribute into something much more dramatic than any of them could have imagined. Within minutes of James Mitchell's radio communication, the Palace Security Command Center had initiated standard response protocols. The mention of a large gathering and crowd of 50-plus tourists near the palace gates triggered automatic security measures that had been developed in response to various threat scenarios over the years. Security Chief Inspector William Harrison was monitoring communications from the command center when the alert came through. A veteran of 23 years in Royal Protection Services, Harrison had learned to take no chances when it came to unusual crowd behavior near any royal residence. His experience had taught him that even seemingly innocent gatherings could quickly become problematic. "All units, we have reports of an organized gathering of tourists near the main palace gates." Harrison's voice crackled through the security radio network. "Unknown purpose estimated 50 to 60 individuals. Request immediate assessment and crowd management protocols." James Mitchell received the response with growing concern. He had hoped his request for additional monitoring would be handled quietly, but the formal security response suggested that his superiors were taking the situation more seriously than he had anticipated. He could see plainclothes security officers beginning to position. themselves around the perimeter of the gathering. The tourists involved in Sarah's impromptu memorial service remained completely unaware of the security response developing around them. They were focused on the touching stories being shared and the beautiful music that Tommy continued to play. The atmosphere remained warm and respectful, with people from different countries sharing their own stories of lost loved ones and unfulfilled dreams. Emma had positioned herself as Sarah's unofficial assistant, helping to collect the scattered pieces of the broken music box while listening intently to every story shared by the gathered tourists. The 7-year-old was experiencing a profound lesson in human compassion and international friendship that would stay with her for the rest of her life. My grandfather also had dreams he never fulfilled, shared Hiroshi, the Japanese tourist. He wanted to see the cherry blossoms in Washington, D.C., but he died before he could travel. My family planted a cherry tree in his honor instead. Sarah was deeply moved by the way her grandmother's story had encouraged others to share their own experiences with loss and remembrance. I think Maria would be amazed to know that her dream had touched so many people from so many different places. Margaret Fletcher was working with David Thompson to draft a letter to Queen Elizabeth, describing Maria's lifelong fascination with British royalty and the touching tribute that had developed spontaneously among international tourists. Their collaboration was creating a beautifully written account of the morning's events. We should mention how this little girl's innocent mistake brought everyone together, Margaret suggested, smiling at Emma. That's the kind of detail that makes a story memorable to royalty. Unknown to the letter writers, their activities were being carefully observed by security personnel, who were trying to determine the nature and purpose of the gathering. From a distance, the sight of adults writing documents while surrounded by an international crowd could potentially be interpreted as something more organized than a spontaneous memorial service. Chief Inspector Harrison arrived on the scene in an unmarked vehicle, positioning himself where he could observe the gathering without being obvious. His trained eye immediately noted several concerning factors. The crowd was larger than initially reported. It included people from multiple nationalities. Someone was recording the event with professional equipment, and there appeared to be some form of document preparation taking place. Control. This is Harrison, he spoke into his radio. Crowd appears to be engaged in organized activity. Recommend initiating dispersal protocols and individual screening procedures. James Mitchell felt his stomach tighten as he heard the command through his earpiece. He desperately wanted to intervene and explain that this was a harmless tribute to a deceased grandmother. But his military training prevented him from breaking protocol during an active security operation. The first sign that something was changing came when additional uniformed police officers began to appear around the plaza. Most of the tourists in Sarah's group noticed the increased security presence but assumed it was normal protocol following the conclusion of the guard ceremony. Attention, please. A police sergeant called out as he approached the group. We need to ask everyone to begin dispersing in an orderly fashion. The ceremony has concluded, and we ask that you continue your tour activities in other areas. Sarah looked around in confusion. Is there some problem, officer? We were just sharing stories about my grandmother. The sergeant, who had been briefed only on the security concerns and not the human details of the situation, responded according to his training. Ma'am, we've received reports of an organized gathering that needs to be cleared for security reasons. Everyone needs to move along now. Emma tugged on her mother's coat sleeve, her voice filled with worry. Mommy, are we in trouble? Did I get everyone in trouble because I broke the music box? Rebecca Thompson felt a chill of fear as she realized that their beautiful morning was taking a disturbing turn. No, sweetheart, you didn't do anything wrong. This is just a misunderstanding. Tommy, the street performer, began to pack up his guitar, confused by the sudden change in atmosphere. Officer, we weren't causing any problems. We were just honoring this lady's grandmother who passed away. Sir, please cooperate with the dispersal order. The sergeant replied firmly. No one is in trouble, but this gathering needs to end now. Margaret Fletcher, drawing on her decades of experience as a British citizen who understood protocol, stepped forward to address the situation. Officer, I believe there may be some confusion here. This is not a planned demonstration or organized event. This is a spontaneous tribute that developed after a tourist accident. Chief Inspector Harrison, observing from his position, noted the elderly British woman's intervention with interest. Her demeanor and speech patterns suggested someone familiar with proper procedures. which either made her less of a concern or potentially more sophisticated than the situation appeared. As security personnel began to more actively encourage the crowd to disperse, Sarah realized with growing horror that the beautiful tribute to her grandmother was being treated as some kind of security threat. The irony was devastating. Maria's dream of experiencing British royal tradition was turning into a nightmare of suspicion and forced dispersal. The situation was escalating rapidly beyond anyone's control, and none of the participants yet realized that within minutes, this misunderstanding would trigger the most serious security response that Buckingham Palace had implemented in years. As the security situation continued to escalate, David Thompson made a decision that would dramatically change the course of events. Realizing that the police officers weren't understanding the true nature of their gathering, he pulled out his phone and began recording the interaction, hoping to document what he believed was an overreaction to a harmless memorial service. "Officer, with respect, I think there's been a serious misunderstanding here," David said as he held up his phone. "We're just tourists who were moved by this woman's story about her deceased grandmother. There's nothing threatening about what we're doing." The sight of David recording the police interaction immediately triggered additional security protocols. Chief Inspector Harrison spoke urgently into his radio. "Control, we have video recording of police operations by subjects who are refusing to disperse. Request immediate backup in preparation for potential lockdown procedures." The escalation was swift and overwhelming. Within minutes, additional police vehicles arrived on the scene, and the area around the gathering was being cordoned off. What had begun as a touching tribute to Maria's memory was rapidly becoming a significant security incident that none of the participants had intended or anticipated. Guardsman James Mitchell watched with growing dismay as the situation spiraled out of control. He knew that once security protocols reached this level, there would be no simple way to de-escalate the response. His training told him to maintain his position and follow orders, but his human instincts were screaming that this was a terrible mistake. Sarah found herself at the center of a nightmare that seemed impossible to believe. She was holding the broken pieces of her grandmother's music box while police officers treated her and the kind strangers who had offered comfort as potential security threats. The contrast between the love and compassion that had developed organically and the suspicion and force being applied by authorities was heartbreaking. "Please," Sarah said to the nearest officer, her voice breaking with emotion. "You have to understand, my grandmother just died and I came here to honor her memory." "These people were trying to help me cope with my loss." Emma had started crying again, overwhelmed by the confusion and the frightening presence of so many police officers. The 7-year-old couldn't understand how her simple mistake with the music box had led to such a scary situation. Rebecca held her daughter tightly while trying to process the surreal turn of events. The situation reached a critical point when Chief Inspector Harrison made the decision to implement full lockdown procedures. "All units initiate Code Yellow protocols. Secure the perimeter and prepare for individual screening of all subjects in the gathering." Code Yellow was a designation that hadn't been used at Buckingham Palace in over 3 years. It indicated a potential security threat that required the temporary lockdown of the immediate area, while authorities assessed the situation. The protocol was designed for scenarios involving possible organized threats to royal security. Margaret Fletcher, drawing on her decades of experience with British institutions, realized that the situation had escalated beyond normal crowd control. "This is absurd," she said loudly enough for several officers to hear. "I've been attending these ceremonies for 30 years, and I can assure you that this is nothing more than a group of tourists sharing a moment of human kindness." Her protest, while well-intentioned, was interpreted by security personnel as resistance to lawful orders, which only reinforced their concern that this might be an organized group with prepared responses to police intervention. Tommy, the street performer, found himself being questioned about his presence and his reasons for playing music. The officers were professional but thorough, treating his guitar case as potential evidence and requesting identification and documentation of his permit to perform in the area. "I was just trying to help honor a dead woman's memory," Tommy explained repeatedly. "There's nothing sinister about playing Amazing Grace for a grieving granddaughter." As the lockdown procedures were implemented, tourists throughout the plaza were being directed away from the cordoned area. Many people who had witnessed the earlier memorial service were confused and concerned about why their fellow tourists were being detained and questioned. The irony of the situation was not lost on Sarah, who realized that her grandmother's simple dream of experiencing British royal tradition had inadvertently triggered the most serious security response the palace had seen in years. Maria would have been simultaneously amazed and horrified to know that her music box had played a role in such dramatic events. James Mitchell made a decision that would require tremendous courage. Breaking with protocol, he approached Chief Inspector Harrison directly. "Sir, I've been observing this situation from the beginning. I believe there's been a significant misunderstanding." Harrison looked at the young guardsman with surprise. "Explain yourself, soldier." The gathering began when a child accidentally broke a tourist's music box that belonged to her deceased grandmother, James said quickly. Everything that followed was a spontaneous expression of sympathy from other tourists. "There's no organized threat here, sir." The chief inspector studied James's face carefully, recognizing the sincerity in the young man's expression. Harrison had enough experience to know when his officers encountered genuine versus manufactured situations, and something in the guardsman's demeanor suggested that a mistake might indeed have been made. "Are you certain about this assessment?" Harrison asked. "Absolutely certain, sir. I witnessed the entire sequence of events. This is a grieving woman who came here to honor her grandmother's memory, not any kind of security threat." Harrison looked across the cordoned area at Sarah, who was still clutching the broken pieces of her grandmother's music box while being questioned by his officers. For the first time since arriving on the scene, he began to consider that his security response might have been disproportionate to the actual situation. The chief inspector made a decision that would require him to acknowledge a significant operational error. Walking directly to Sarah, he introduced himself and asked to hear her story firsthand. As she explained about Maria's lifelong dream and the accidental destruction of the music box, Harrison realized that his team had indeed misinterpreted a moment of human compassion as a potential security threat. Within 30 minutes, the lockdown was lifted and apologies were being offered to all the detained tourists. But the damage to what should have been a beautiful tribute to Maria's memory seemed irreparable. Sarah sat on a nearby bench, still holding the broken pieces of her grandmother's treasured music box, wondering how such a simple gesture of love had led to such an overwhelming misunderstanding. It was then that Chief Inspector Harrison approached her with an unexpected offer that would transform this day of heartbreak into something that Maria herself could never have imagined, even in her wildest dreams about British royalty and the kindness of strangers.